Iran has found a treasure trove of Israeli nuclear documents. Do you know anything about this?
This is the largest intelligence leak in the history of the Mossad. They were able to pilfer these documents and bring them back to Iran, through agents that they had in Israel. Um, Now, I don't know if it's true or not. One thing that I find I don't understand why Iran is declaring this, because you would think it would be to their advantage to keep the Israelis in the dark about what they know. But maybe they found out, this is just a guess, pure speculation on my part. Okay, they did in fact acquire these documents, all this intelligence. And then they learned shortly thereafter or during the process that the Israelis became aware of it. And so there was no harm in declaring it publicly, and why they would do that, I'm not sure. Maybe it's just uh, to uh, to reassure their own citizens, or to impress their own citizens. Again, Iran has been at the receiving end of a lot of covert attacks, over the years, and there have been clear intelligence failures within Iran. And I think there are a lot of criticism directed against the intelligence services within Iran, counterintelligence there. And so maybe this is a chance for them to toot their own horn, or there may be some reason too that they want other countries to know about this. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to make of that story. It may be true. Who knows?
Well, if they announced it publicly, then why not just release it? Because otherwise you
Yeah.
just say, well, we have this, but no one can see it. And then that becomes a problem, right? So if you make an announcement that you have it, that means you have the intention to release it, surely, right?
Right. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. That's what I find myself wondering. So I have my doubts about it, but there may be some logic behind it. I haven't really seen that explained. I just don't know what to make of that story. I'll be honest with you.
What happens? What happens if they do release it? Like the whole
Yeah,
world
well,
is
it depends
aware.
on what the contents are, really. That's um,
Well, if it's just irrefutable proof that, okay, here's proof that Israel has a nuclear weapons program,
okay,
which we all
right.
know.
That's something, right? Yeah, that would obviously be to their advantage. I guess that's the main thing. That would be the main intelligence find, and this would, I think, reveal the double standard. I think most countries are aware of it, but it would just make it glaringly obvious that, again, Israel has nuclear weapons, and they are not part of the NPT. They acquired it actually through theft of information and materials from the U.S., I believe during the early 1960s. And okay, Israel has this nuclear arsenal, and yet they feel like they can, demand that Iran not only, not acquire nuclear weapons, but can't even have a conventional nuclear capability, for the production of electricity. And that's just a glaring double standard. It should be obvious to anybody, but this makes it even more obvious. And would, yeah, I guess that may be the main purpose of publicizing it. It's just to show the world that, hey, look, we've been the ones who are really violating the NPT. I guess they're technically not violating because they're not part of it, but at least the spirit of the NPT is Israel. It's not ourselves. We're in complete compliance.
Right. Yeah, feel like if it's clear that it's out there, there has to be, there's always this kind of, everybody knew in the United States, but because it wasn't the official stance that of Israel, we would just say, oh, we never broached that question. But if it just becomes irrefutable that they do have nuclear weapons, don't we have laws in place saying we can't sell weapons to this country because they are a nuclear armed power that's not part of the NTP, that they would be subject to
Yeah.
sanctions from other countries, because now it's undeniable.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think that's true. But of course, we have a lot of laws in the books that actually should prevent us from supplying um, weapons and ammunition to Israel. And we violate those laws all the time. In fact, you may recall that during Biden's presidency, it came up. There was a question of whether Israel had violated some, human rights standards that were set in U.S. law. And clearly they had. I mean, not even, I think it was actually, the question was about the West Bank, and clearly they were. But um, but Blinken just simply declared that they were in complete compliance, and then the weapons continued to flow. So, I mean, I think that's just what's going to happen, unfortunately. That's always what happens in the case of Israel. They'll just pretend, even though the evidence is out there, everybody knows it. And in fact, pretty much everybody knows it already. But if the Iranians actually release the documents, prove that this is going on, they'll still just pretend like it didn't happen. Because Israel's Israel, and Israel's not subject to the laws that all other countries are subject to.
What's the goal for Israel now? I mean, obviously, we know ethnic cleansing, creating greater Israel, but what we're seeing in Gaza, they're juggling this PR war that they're clearly losing. The people in Gaza, there's, who knows how many have been slaughtered so far, but it almost feels like it's going to just be this slow grind, this slow genocide. Like, how long can it go on? I mean, they can't kill everybody, right? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's gone on a lot longer than I thought it could. The world has shown way too much patience for this. Um, yeah, it's not
but it's wearing thinner the longer it goes on.
right.
It's just like there
Yeah,
has to be, I mean, I think probably Trump and the administration understand that this is not good for them either. I think they do want it to end. But there's always this question: why can't we make it stop? Why can't we have it stop? Why can't we just stop sending bombs? It seems
yeah,
like a
right.
very simple thing to do,
Yeah,
but it just continues, and it just going to seems like it
right.
just slowly grind out, and then
Yeah,
people are just
yeah,
getting sicker and sicker and more disgusted until what?
yeah. I don't know. I could say we've seen the first cracks in the edifice. Maybe they're just hairline fractures right at this point. But we have seen at least, Western leaders start to make real criticisms. Again, they're not backing it up with anything, and maybe they probably never will. But it is something. It shows that the pressure is building on them. Let's at least put it that way, um, and they're feeling it. And then we even see former defense ministers and generals and former prime minister of Israel admitting that, hey, we're committing war crimes, and we're killing babies, this kind of thing, and it's deliberate. These again are Israeli defense leaders, and a former prime minister Olmert. They're, they're haven't actually used the word genocide, but they're getting very close to it, and so that shows again that there is pressure that's building. Unfortunately, you just don't see it in Israeli society as a whole. There are these individuals. Um, so it's just sad to say, but I think it shows every sign of just going on and on. Um, give you some idea of like what the actual toll has been on the Gazans. There was a study that was done. It was an international collaboration of different researchers, and they estimated life expectancy in Gaza. I don't know how they do this, but these researchers have their way. They have their methods. So they said prior to October 7th, life expectancy in Gaza was actually pretty good. It was 75.5, which is really not bad, and but that has dropped to 40.5. That's according to the research, in recent months. So it's actually dropped by half. Now, what does that mean? Well, I mean, that could be reflected, it could be a reflection of different realities. Let's say we're talking about nearly half. Well, just to simplify things, we'll say it's half because it's really very nearly half of what it used to be. Um, or I should say a little bit more than half of what it used to be. Now, but let's just call it half. So that either could be that half the population has been killed, or you can look at the other extreme. Nobody was killed, but life expectancy for everybody has been reduced by a half. Either way, you're talking about something just catastrophic. You are talking about the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. I think there's no way to, some of the deaths, like we'll see, are happening now. There very well could be hundreds of thousands. I think probably. Well, there's really no question. And again, there are other studies. I think the Lancet did one that this was several months ago that estimated 250,000. Because again, you get these direct deaths that are recorded by the very limited health system that still exists there. But clearly, the direct deaths are going to be higher than that. And then there are the indirect deaths, the people who just couldn't make it to the hospital, because of the war and so on and so forth. Um, so, yeah, we're talking about potentially, right now, like even if the war stopped today, we're talking about like half the population of Gaza, either, people that have died already, people who will die in the next few months, but even people that are going to die 10 years from now or 20 years from now, but are dying 20, 30 years younger than they would have. We've talked about malnutrition. There are a lot of, many, we don't know how many, but at least dozens have died already directly of malnutrition. But how many have died, with malnutrition as a contributing factor? And these kids, they've been permanently damaged. So even if they're brought back, if they're fed and they recover from this, survive, they've already suffered permanent damage. And how many of them are going to die, are not going to have full lives. They're going to die, at age 40 or whatever. This is what we're looking at. And we're just getting estimates of the toll that has been taken. But it's going to be huge. Even if the war stops today.
There's something that I saw going around Twitter the other day about there was a Wikipedia page entry about the war in Gaza. We shouldn't really call it a war, but they had listed all the belligerents. And with the Israeli side on the Wikipedia page, it says, it has the Israeli names, the commanders, and then it also has ISIS linked faction that is on side with Israel. And I believe there was some comment that Netanyahu made openly about activating ISIS essentially in Gaza. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, I do. Let's see. Who was it? It was, I think, a former defense minister that, yeah, I can't, but, somebody very high rank, either a former prime minister or a former defense minister that made the accusation directly. I mean, he just said, as a matter of fact, he asserted that, Israel is using these ISIS-linked militias in Gaza. And Netanyahu didn't deny it. He just made it say, we use whatever approach is effective. And we know something about them. I think one faction or one militia is headed by a drug dealer, a former drug dealer, somebody who had been convicted and was jailed in Gaza prior to October 7th. And the other one was actually somebody who had been charged with murder, convicted murderer, and he too was in prison. I think the prison itself was bombed and they escaped. And now the Israelis are working with these guys and they have created these militias. And they have, apparently have ISIS links. I don't know exactly the nature of that. But that's what's going on. And it's just, there's no question about it. And then later, there were even satellite photos showing these militias operating in Israeli-controlled territory. They're there, and that's what they're using them against Hamas, trying to build up this counterforce. Now, it just sounds so wild, but it's the thing that both is the sort of thing that Israel and the U.S. has done in many previous cases, going all the way back, to the war, the Mujahideen war against the Soviet-supported Afghan regime and the Soviet army, way back in the 1980s. It's something that both Israel and we have done, again and again. We have used these as proxies, these forces, Al-Qaeda-like forces, the Mujahideen, and here ISIS. So it's clearly happening.
Where did ISIS come from? Because I hear accusations saying that ISIS is a creation of Israel and CIA, or do we know anything about this? Like, is it in large part Because people always say, why did ISIS never attack Israel? They're real busy
Right.
killing, Shiites and Christians, but,
Right. Yeah.
Israel's
Well,
their friend.
yeah. No, I think actually when we're talking about Syria, for example, and why that was Al Qaeda. I don't know if there was actually, in fact, the U.S. did wage war against ISIS and helped to eliminate ISIS from at least a part of, not all of Syria. I think they actually allowed a certain number to remain because, again, they saw them as, useful proxies against Assad. Um, I don't know about. I've heard that rumor. I don't know. I doubt that we actually created them, but clearly at different times we've seen them as useful. We have fought them. We did fight them clearly, and or, supported the Iraqi government in fighting ISIS in Iraq, and we did actually fight them at least in partially. Let's say maybe not. It wasn't a total war, but we did fight them in Syria as well.
Right.
Now
But
Al Qaeda is kind of a different story, especially in Syria, where clearly we had from the beginning that the Al Qaeda chapter in Syria is called Al Nusra, and we worked with them. And in fact, we have some emails going way back, to around 2011, admitting as much. To Hillary Clinton was aware of it. I think it was actually Jake Sullivan.
right.
That
Jake
he said,
Sullivan
yeah,
to Hillary Clinton. Al
right,
Qaeda's on our
exactly.
side in
Yeah,
Syria.
right. And he was talking about Al Nusra, and now we have the former head of now Al Nusra and the former head of the ISIS chapter in Syria, Al Jawlani or now Al Shara
Right.
or
So
whatever.
isn't that pretty
And yeah,
suspicious?
yeah,
Right.
yeah. And it was clear. Yeah, I think that we always maintain, even though we had a bounty on his head, there was, we always maintained connections with him.
So we were
There's no
supporting
question
Al
about
Qaeda, and I think we were supporting ISIS. And when we say we don't talk about the United States, but Israel itself, okay, the United States fought ISIS in parts of Syria, Iraq. But did Israel ever do anything to really fight ISIS, or were they
I
always
don't.
just kind of
Well, I'm not sure, but I don't think so, and I think it's because ISIS didn't really have any presence in southern Syria, where the Israelis were. But Al Qaeda, Al Nusra definitely did, and they did work with them. There's just no question about it. They treated their soldiers, provided them with small arms. And then you notice that, yeah, again, Al Nusra never attacked Israel, and then the current regime, headed by Mr. Al Nusra himself, is trying to make peace with Israel and will not attack him.
yeah. The shame is that it takes everything that's in the Middle East. It takes a little bit of diligence to kind of understand the region. And I think the problem is just the vast majority of people won't put in the time to kind of understand the basics. So that way they can't, they're not aware of what's happened, that everything we've been told about the Middle East is a lie.
Mm-hmm.
That we were supporting Al Qaeda, the situation with ISIS. Most people don't know the difference between Sunni and Shia. The whole thing is just a mess, and they're able to just point. They're like, they're all Arabs, they're all terrorists. This type of generalization. That's the
Right.
big problem. Instead of realizing that, like, wow, just how we have been feeding all the worst elements in the Middle
Right.
East, all of these terrorist factions. The the terrorism isn't coming out of Shia extremists. They are Sunni extremists that are backed by the United States and Israel. And
Right.
I just wish people could break through. I think a lot of people just know that there's something wrong, but that's the problem, is that
Right.
they don't quite get it. They're like, oh yeah, they're the bad guys, and Israel's helping us fight those bad guys, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No. No. You're right. And people should know it because, yeah. Again, people have a very simplistic picture. It's the West with Israel against the Muslim crazies, the Islamic extremists. And no, actually, when you look closely, it's those extremists that tend to be allied, with the West and Israel. That's completely true. Yeah, that's without a doubt.
Right. And you can
And
see
fighting the moderates. I mean, that's been clearly the policy of Israel all along, is that they always try to support the hardliners and try to do their best to subvert and um, subvert the moderates. That's been their constant policy because, again, they do not want a peace deal. Let's just say that. It's just clear that they would like to maintain. They want to expand, and you can't expand if you have a peace deal. So you keep the hardliners in power because that gives you an excuse. Even there, it's not really much of an excuse, but it gives you an excuse to continue to expand. Hamas itself was the hardline group. Now, I'm not going to include Hamas. Well, they have been allied with the extremists, but they are not. They're not head choppers in the way that ISIS and Al Qaeda is. Despite all the efforts to just describe them as a pure terror organization, that's exactly how they're always described, even in Haaretz, the left-wing newspaper. It's not a fair characterization, but they were relatively hard line, and in general, but there are important exceptions. They have made gestures to say, yeah, we're open to a two-state solution, but in general, they've opposed it. And that is the reason that Netanyahu himself favored Hamas over, for example, the alternatives, which was, formerly the PLO and then Al Fatah. I think they're one and the same. But yeah, that's been Israeli policy all along. Support the hard line, the extremists where you can, and do whatever you can um, to actually neutralize the moderates, so that we continue with our expansion. We can always look for a military solution because that's what we want. We don't actually want a negotiated settlement. A negotiated settlement would mean fixed borders, and that's not what Israel wants. They want those borders to keep on moving.
What an awful state Israel is. It's just so out of control.
Yeah.
It's really wild. Okay,
Yeah,
well, just to
and we just have to bear a lot of the responsibility for it because we have supported all those elements. We did nothing, we obviously they were dependent. And just like in Ukraine or whatever, we could have put on the brakes and said, okay, wait a second, these ultra nationalists or whatever, this is unacceptable. We're going to cut off aid if you don't bring these guys under control. But we never did that. We've just continued, and so they have a sense of impunity, and the ultra nationalists have risen to the top in both countries.
okay, we'll end it here in just a second. Just one last
Okay,
question is
sure.
what's next with this nuclear deal with Iran?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's just that it seems that we're still trying to push the zero enrichment um, uh, demand on Iran, and Iran just will not accept it. So again, this cannot go ahead. So it's a mess. It's clearly a mess. I think Trump doesn't want to have a war. And in fact, he apparently, he's told Netanyahu to back off and not make any attacks. He's trying to make a deal. But at the same time, he's caving in to all the people that are pressuring him to impose these draconian conditions on Iran. And he just doesn't understand, too, that just like, he thought he could bully the Chinese into accepting his demands, and he's finding out that he can't do neither can he bully the Iranians. And the Iranians, I think, are they're feeling they have resisted these demands in the past when they were in a much weaker position. They're in their position has strengthened remarkably over the last several years. Again, they have allies now. They're not isolated. They were really alone and isolated in the world, a decade ago, and certainly 2 decades ago. But they have come in from the cold, or you could say that it's just like, well, they came in from the cold, but now Russia and China, and they all find themselves in the same room, and they all are dealing with the same bully. And so, yeah, anyway, they are not alone. They have strengthened themselves economically and militarily, and they have strong allies. And I think there's just no reason that they're going to give in to this. And if it does lead to attack, they feel like they can handle it. I'm sure, they observed what happened in the Red Sea. It's just like they couldn't possibly not notice.
Okay. Well, I feel like we're walking a tightrope for
Yeah, we are.
several